was not yet dry when the midwife asked him the question no one else in the house had dared to ask aloud. "Are you the father, Your Grace?" Hetty Combs stood in the doorway of the birthing chamber with a swaddled child in the crook of each arm, and she did not lower her eyes, though she was speaking to a duke. Patience Vane, who had been Patience Ray a year and a half before, and was now, by the paper drying on the table behind her husband, about to be neither, lay against the pillows and heard the question land the way a stone lands in still water, the rings of it spreading long after the stone itself has sunk from sight. Gideon Vane, Duke of Harcastle, stood in the corridor with a pen still between his fingers, and he did not answer. He would remember, afterward, that it was the smell of beeswax and blood that reached him first, before the question did, and that he had thought, absurdly, of his own mother's hands. He did not yet know what the answer would cost him. Had he known, he would have signed all the same, and that, in the end, was the whole of his trouble. Sir Josiah Pell, who had ridden 2 hours through a spitting rain to witness a signature and collect a decree, stood at a respectful distance with his hat under his arm and his conscience considerably less settled than his face let on. "The seal must be affixed within 9 days, Your Grace," he said, in the flat, careful voice of a man who has learned that the law is safest read aloud in full, or the sitting at Michaelmas will not receive it, and the matter must wait the 12-month. 9 days. Patience heard the number and understood, with the strange clarity that comes to women newly delivered of children, that 9 days was not a mercy, but a debt come due, and that she had exactly that long to prove what she had not yet even let herself hope was true. She did not weep. She had not wept since the letter came, 3 weeks before, informing her that her husband believed her a stranger to her own marriage bed, and she was not now going to begin in front of the only 2 men in England whose opinion of her could still be altered by tears. Gideon looked, at last, not at his wife, but at the children in the midwife's arms. And something crossed his face that was not quite grief and not quite hunger, and was gone before Hetty could name it. "I have signed it," he said. "That is the whole of the matter. It is not the whole of anything," said Hetty, "until you have answered me." He turned from her then, the ring on his smallest finger turning once beneath his thumb, and walked out into the rain without his hat. And Sir Josiah, after a moment's unhappy hesitation, followed him, and the decree lay on the table where he had left it, black and final and, though none of them could yet say so, entirely built upon a lie. It had not always been so between them. A year and a half is not so very long, but it had held inside it nearly the whole of a marriage most people in the county still could not account for. And to understand how a duke had come to sign away his own children before he had so much as counted their fingers, one must go back to the spring before, to a parish house with a leaking roof, and a curate 3/4 buried before he was 3/4 paid for, and a young woman who had learned to keep her father's accounts before she had learned to keep her own counsel. Reverend Josiah Ray, no relation to Sir Josiah, a coincidence the county found endlessly diverting, had died owing £11 4 shillings to the miller, 6 to the apothecary, and considerably more than that to Pride, and it had fallen to his only child to settle what could be settled, and to bury the rest with him. Patience had done both, without complaint, because complaint was a coin she had never been taught to spend, and it was in the middle of totting up the parish poor box, 3 days after the funeral, that a duke's carriage had stopped in the lane, and a duke's cousin had stepped down from it to look her over the way a woman looks over a bolt of cloth she has already decided to buy. That was Rosalind Vane's way, and it was well before Patience learned to fear it. "You keep a tidy hand," Rosalind said, glancing at the ledger still open on the parlor table, and there was nothing in her voice to object to, which was precisely the trouble with everything Rosalind Vane ever said. My cousin has need of a wife who can keep a house the way you keep a column of figures, without sentiment and without error. Patience, who had buried her father 4 days before and had £11 4 shillings of debt and no dowry and no prospects beyond a curate's cottage soon to belong to some other curate, did not mistake this for a compliment and did not pretend to. Your cousin wants a housekeeper who will share his bed and his name, she said, and I am to understand this is meant as an honor. It is meant as an arrangement, Rosalind said, and smiled, and the smile did not reach anywhere past her mouth. The Duke of Harcastle does not offer arrangements to women he considers beneath consideration. Consider yourself flattered, Miss Ray, or do not. The offer stands until Thursday. It was Gideon himself, 3 days later, who came to state the terms plainly, and Patience would remember for the rest of her life that he had not once, in that whole interview, looked at her as a man looks at a woman he means to marry. He had looked at her the way he might look at a contract he intended to honor to the letter and no further. I will clear your father's debts and see him move to consecrated ground within the month, he said, standing near the door as though he did not intend to stay long enough to need a chair. You will keep my house, manage my correspondence where my cousin does not, and give the county no cause to discuss us. I do not ask for affection. I have found affection an expensive commodity and a poor investment. I ask only for order. Then we are agreed, Patience said, for I have never yet been able to afford affection either, and I am told I keep a very tidy column. Something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth and was gone before it could commit to being one. Nothing more need be said then, nothing more, she agreed. And if either of them had known how much would in fact need saying, and how dearly the silence between them would come to cost, they might have chosen their bargain's wording with greater care. Hetty Combe, who had delivered Patience into the world 26 years before, and considered this fact sufficient license to speak her mind to anyone, Duke included, met her on the road to Harcastle Hall, with her fists already on her hips. Marrying a man who wants a ledger instead of a wife, she said, is a fine way to end up exactly as lonely as you started, only in better rooms. The rooms, said Patience, have a roof that does not leak. Aye, well, said Hetty, a roof's no bad thing to have over a lonely woman, I'll grant you that much. She fell into step alongside the carriage all the same, muttering that some houses remembered kindness longer than others did unkindness, and that Harcastle Hall, in her long experience of its births and its deaths, was not one of the kind ones. Rosalind Vane received the new Duchess at the top of the great stair with an orange flower water sweetness that did not once falter, not when she showed Patience to rooms 2 doors from the nursery, no child yet occupied, not when she handed over the household ledgers with the air of a woman surrendering something she expected to reclaim by autumn. A house remembers what a heart forgets, she said, watching Patience's thumb travel down a column of figures with the unhurried precision of a woman for whom numbers were a native tongue. You will find Harcastle remembers a great deal. I hope you have the patience for it. I believe I was named for exactly that quality, Patience said, without looking up, and I have not yet found the house that could exhaust it. It was on the second evening. Turning back through the quarter's accounts to satisfy herself, she understood the running of the estate before she claimed to run any part of it, that Patience first noticed the page that did not sit quite right among its fellows, a leaf of household disbursements recopied in a hand, meant to pass for the steward's own. The ink a shade too black against paper gone soft and yellow at its edges. The entry for a certain Mr. Coyle's wages a full crown heavier than the months surrounding it. She could not have said, that first night, why the discrepancy troubled her. She only knew, with the instinct of a woman who had balanced her father's poor box for 9 years, and never once seen it come out wrong by accident. That ink does not go fresh on old paper without a hand behind it, and she folded the knowledge away the way she folded away everything she could not yet use, for a day when it would matter. Below stairs, the servants took wagers on how long the marriage would survive its own arrangement, and in the village, the innkeeper kept a private book on the subject that did rather brisker trade than his ale. Cecily Thorne, whose family seat marched with Harcastle's western fields, and who had spent 2 seasons expecting to be the one to civilize its grave, silent duke, called twice in a fortnight to look the new Duchess over with a coolness only slightly less naked than Rosalind's had been, and pronounced to anyone who would listen that a curate's daughter with ink-stained fingers had done very well. For herself indeed, and would no doubt continue to do so for exactly as long as it suited a man who had never once, in anyone's memory, kept a promise past the point of its usefulness. It was into this house, then, its ledgers quietly wrong in one corner, its cousin sweetly watchful in every other, its new Duchess counting figures by candlelight to keep her hands from trembling at anything else, that the king's summons arrived on a wet Tuesday in May, calling the Duke of Harcastle to muster with his regiment before Lady Day, and naming no date at all for his return, only the shape of the war that would decide it, and it was this, more than any ledger, more than any cousin's smile, that set the whole long clock of the story running. He came to find her the night before he left, in the small estate office where she had taken to working after the household was abed, because the figures made better sense to her, she said, when no one was watching her make sense of them. He found her with her forefinger tapping once, twice, against her thumb, the habit of a woman tallying sums she had not written down. And he watched her for a moment before he spoke, the way a man watches a candle to see whether it will hold against a draught. "You have not asked me not to go," he said. "Would it have altered anything if I had?" "No. Then you have my answer as to why I did not ask." He almost laughed at that, not quite, but almost, and she marked it the way she marked every entry that did not balance against what she had first been told to expect of him, filing it under a heading she had not yet dared to name. "My mother," he said, and stopped, and began again in the flatter voice of a man laying down a debt he has carried too long alone. "My mother was accused of a thing she may or may not have done, and my father did not wait to learn which, and I was 11 years old, and I watched a house that had loved her decide, within a fortnight, that it had never loved her at all. I do not intend to be made a fool of in that particular fashion twice in one family." "That is not a confidence," Patience said gently. "That is a warning." "It is both," he said, "and I find I have given you the first half of a thing I am not yet able to give you whole. The rest will keep. Then I will keep it for you," she said, "until you are ready to spend it," and it was, though neither of them called it so, the nearest thing to a vow either had yet made the other. He left before dawn with the regiment's colors, and a wife who had not asked him to stay, and Rosalind Vane, watching the column ride out from an upstairs window, with her hand very still upon the sill, was heard by no one to say anything at all, which anyone who knew her should perhaps have found more alarming than anything she might have spoken aloud. The house without him in it settled into a rhythm Patience found she did not entirely dislike. She kept the ledgers, corresponded with the steward on matters of drainage and rent and the mending of the home farm's roof, and taught herself, evening by evening, the particular grammar of an estate the way she had once taught herself the grammar of a poor parish's poor box, by which method every account, however grand, is finally only a story about what was promised and what was paid. Rosalind managed what correspondence came from the regiment, since she had always done so, and saw no reason a new duchess should trouble herself with a soldier's dull dispatches, and if Patience found this arrangement faintly strange, She found a great many things about Harcastle faintly strange, and had not yet learned which strangenesses to trust. Hetty came twice a week with garden herbs and gossip in equal measure, and it was Hetty who first remarked, apropos of nothing, that the old thrush in the physic garden had taken to singing past dusk, which her grandmother had always held to mean that someone under that roof was telling a lie the birds could hear better than the people could. Which someone? Patience asked, only half in jest. That, said Hetty, the thrush declines to specify. Word came in high summer, by a route so circuitous that no one in the house could afterward agree who had first repeated it, that the Duke's regiment had been ordered into winter quarters some 60 miles distant and would not march again before spring, and Rosalind delivered this news to Patience with exactly the correct measure of regret. And it was, Patience would later understand, very nearly the last entirely honest thing Rosalind Vane said to her for the better part of a year. He came in October, in secret, and told no one but the housekeeper who kept his gate, because he had 4 hours before he was due back at his post, and did not intend to spend one of them explaining himself to a household. He had written ahead, a single line, sent by his own hand to Rosalind, who managed such correspondence, asking that a fire be kept lit in his own rooms against a possible arrival he could not promise, and would not have announced more widely for fear of raising hopes he might yet be forced to disappoint. He arrived past midnight, road-worn, smelling of wet wool and cold iron, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has not slept indoors in a fortnight, and Patience, woken by the sound of a horse she knew before she knew why she knew it, met him on the stair with a candle in her hand, and no words at all prepared for the occasion. "I could not send word I was certain of coming," he said, for fear of being wrong, "and I found I would rather surprise you than disappoint you." "You have done neither," she said. "You have frightened me half to death, and I find I do not mind it in the least." Whatever passed between them in the hours that followed belonged to no ledger and answered to no one. And if the house kept any record of it at all, it kept that record only in the quiet way houses keep such things. In warmth remembered by walls, in a fire banked low and not quite out by morning, in the single line he left for her, folded and sealed and given into her own hand rather than his cousin's this time, promising to write properly the moment his duty allowed. He was gone again before the servants woke, having told no one of his coming or his going save the housekeeper at the gate and the wife who had met him on the stair. And it was this, the not telling, the small private tenderness he had meant as a kindness to a household he did not wish to burden with false hope, that Rosalind Vane would turn, in the months to come, into the instrument of nearly everything that followed. She had seen his horse. She had seen, 3 days later, the housekeeper's idle mention of a fire kept lit for a night none but the gatekeeper could account for, and she had understood, with the swift arithmetic of a woman who had spent her whole life adding up other people's happiness and subtracting it from her own, exactly what that fire meant, and exactly what it would mean 9 months hence, and exactly what it would cost her son Julian's slender claim upon a dukedom he had been quietly promised since he could walk, should a legitimate heir arrive to close the account. She did not act at once. She was not a woman who ever acted at once. But the muster roll that recorded the regiment's movements that autumn was, by the time anyone thought to consult it again, a fair copy in a clerk's careful hand, and the fair copy showed no gap in the Duke's attendance anywhere near October at all, and the clerk who had made it, a Mr. Coyle, with ink permanently blackened into the whorls of his right forefinger, found himself 3 crowns richer and considerably more frightened than 3 crowns generally makes a man. By December, Patience knew herself to be with child, and by the turning of the year she knew, with the particular certainty of a woman whose body has never yet lied to her, that she carried 2. She wrote to Gideon at once in her own hand and had no way of knowing that the letter reached Rosalind first, as all his letters did, and that Rosalind read it twice before sealing it again and sending it on a full month late, by which time the arithmetic of the thing had already begun to work against its author. The rumor did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way rumors of that particular shape always arrive, sideways, through a groom's idle remark to a tavern keeper, through Cecily Thorne's cool observation to 3 separate callers that she could not begin to say how the dates were meant to reconcile, given that the Duke had not, so far as anyone in the county could attest, set foot on his own land between May and February, through Rosalind's own soft, regretful murmurs to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear them. That she was certain there was some innocent explanation, that she would not for the world suggest otherwise, that a house remembers what a heart forgets, and it would be a kindness to Patience, truly, if someone were to ask her plainly before the whole county did the arithmetic for her. Patience heard the shape of it before she heard the words, the way a woman standing in a hall can hear a door close somewhere she cannot see and know, from the particular quality of the silence after, that something has been shut against her. She did not deny what she had not yet been accused of. She went on keeping the ledgers, and teaching herself the grammar of accounts grown larger, and pressing her forefinger against her thumb in the dark when the counting would not stop on its own, and she waited, because waiting was the only ledger entry left open to her, for her husband to come home and ask her himself. Rosalind came to her in March, when Patience was heavy with the twins and slow on the stairs, and had begun, at last, to hear the whispers plainly enough to name them. She came with a face arranged into exactly the degree of sorrow the occasion seemed to call for, and she sat, and she folded her hands, and she said the kindest thing she had ever said to Patience in 18 months of careful unkindness. "There need be no scandal at all," she said, "if you were to go quietly, before he returns, to my sister's house in the north, with a settlement I have already arranged and no questions asked on either side. The children would want for nothing. Your name would want for nothing, or as near as makes no difference. And Gideon need never stand in a court and hear read aloud what half the county is already saying in his absence. You are offering me a bribe," Patience said, dressed very prettily as a mercy. "I am offering you dignity." "Dignity," said Patience, "is not for sale, Cousin Rosalind. And I find I would rather stand in every court in England and be called every name the county has troubled itself to invent than take a single shilling to agree I am something I am not. You will regret refusing me." "I have regretted a great many things in my life," Patience said, rising slowly. One hand braced against the desk that held the very ledgers she still, out of habit and stubbornness both, kept faithfully entered. "But I find I have never yet regretted telling the truth, however dearly it was priced, and I do not intend to begin now." With 2 lives besides my own in the balance, Rosalind left with her composure entirely unbroken and her smooth hair not a single strand out of place, and if her hand trembled very slightly on the banister as she went down, no one was present to remark on it, and she would not, in any case, have thanked them for the observation. He came home in April, 3 weeks before his time, released early from his post by a peace no one had thought imminent, and he arrived at Harcastle Hall to find his wife within a fortnight of her confinement and the whole county already certain. On the strength of a muster roll he had no reason yet to doubt that he had been 60 miles distant on every date that could possibly account for it. He did not shout. He was not, whatever the county believed of dukes in general, a man who shouted. He asked her once, in the estate office where she had once tallied his rents by candlelight, whether there was anything she wished to tell him, and she answered that there was a great deal she wished to tell him, beginning with a single October night he had told no one of, but the gatekeeper and herself. And he stood very still and turned the ring on his smallest finger once and said that he had been 60 miles away in October. Every record of the regiment said so, and that he did not know what game she meant to play, but that he would not be made his father's son twice over. Then ask the gatekeeper, she said. Ask the fire that was laid in your own rooms that no one else had caused to light. Ask your own memory, if you will not ask mine. Memory, he said, is precisely what a clever woman relies upon a foolish man to distrust in himself, and it was the cruelest thing he had ever said to her, and she understood, watching his face, that he did not entirely believe it even as he said it, and that this, a man choosing the safety of an old wound over the risk of a new trust, frightened her far more than any lie Rosalind had ever told. He sent for the ecclesiastical commission that same week. He did not wait for the birth. The papers were drawn, and Sir Josiah summoned, so that the whole ugly business might be settled the very hour the children were delivered, and no further delay given to a scandal he had decided, in his grief and his old fear together, could only be survived by amputation, swift and complete. She went into her labor on a Tuesday night, with the decree already lying, unsigned but waiting, on the table outside her door, and she did not know, hearing him pace the corridor for 11 hours, while Hetty Combe delivered first one child, and then, to everyone's astonishment, a second close behind it, whether he was waiting to sign the paper or praying to be given a reason not to. And this was the blackest question of the whole affair, and it went unanswered until the very moment Hetty carried both children to the door and found the ink already dry. Hetty's question stopped him in the corridor the way nothing else that night had managed to. "Are you the father, Your Grace?" she asked again, when he did not answer the first time, and this time she did not let him past her. "I have signed the paper," he said. "The paper says nothing of the sort," said Hetty. "The paper says you no longer wish to be married to the woman who bore these children. It does not say whose face is folded up small in that boy's brow, plain as a portrait, nor whose stubborn chin sits on that girl not an hour old. I have delivered every child born in this valley for 30 years, Your Grace, and I have never yet needed a muster roll to tell me who fathered one." It was Sir Josiah, hovering in the doorway with the unsigned 9 days already ticking somewhere behind his eyes, who found the courage, or the sense, to say what decency required. "The decree need not be lodged before Michaelmas," he said slowly, as though working out the law even as he spoke it, and Michaelmas is 9 days distant. "If there is cause to examine the matter further, Your Grace, the law permits the delay, and I would count myself derelict in my office if I sealed a man's whole family away on the strength of a muster roll I have not myself examined." Gideon looked, for a long moment, at the closed door behind which his wife lay, and at the midwife barring his way with 2 infants in her arms, and at the magistrate offering him, without quite saying so, one last chance to be less of a fool than his father had been, and something in his face that had been shut for 18 months came, very slowly, and against every instinct his grief had trained into him. "Ajar, 9 days, he said. 9 days, Hetty agreed, and God help the lot of us to fill them with something better than pride. Patience began the reckoning from her own bed, propped on pillows with a child asleep in the crook of each arm, and the household ledgers brought to her, at her own insistence, before she had so much as risen. It was there, comparing the muster roll's fair copy against the household accounts she herself had kept faithfully since her marriage, that she found the entry she had filed away 18 months before, and never quite forgotten, the crown of unexplained wages paid to Mr. Coyle in the very quarter the muster roll had been recopied, the ink of both entries a shade too fresh for the paper that carried them. "A house remembers," she said to Hetty. turning the two ledgers side by side upon the coverlet so the discrepancy sat plain between them, a great deal more than Cousin Rosalind intended it to. Hetty sent her nephew, who served with a garrison not 40 miles off, and had a gift for asking soldiers questions in a manner they mistook for idle friendliness, to fetch the original dispatch book from the regiment's own quartermaster, the true record that had never passed through Rosalind's careful hand at all, and it returned within 4 days' bearing, in a plain, unlettered clerk's script no one had troubled to forge, a single line noting the Duke's unaccompanied absence from quarters for one night in October. Granted informally and never entered in the fair copy sent home. Patience sat with that line a long while, her forefinger tapping once against her thumb, before she sent word to Gideon that she wished him to attend the sitting Sir Josiah had, at her request, arranged for the 9th day, and that he should bring his cousin, and that he should, whatever his pride advised him, bring an open mind as well, for she intended to spend every figure she had saved these 18 months proving what a fire laid, for no reason anyone else could account for had already told him, had he only trusted his own memory over another woman's ledger. The sitting was held in the long gallery, because the county's curiosity had grown too large for any smaller room to hold it, and Sir Josiah presided from behind a table bearing, side by side, the fair copy of the muster roll and the true dispatch book newly arrived, while Gideon stood near the cold hearth with his hand closed once and opened again upon nothing, and Rosalind sat composed and gray-silked among the witnesses, with her hands folded exactly as they had always been folded, and Cecily Thorne, to her own evident surprise, found herself called upon to say plainly what she had heard and from whom, and answered, coloring, that she had heard it first and always from Rosalind Vane, and had repeated it in all innocence, believing a cousin would not lie about a cousin's own household. Mr. Coyle was brought in white to the lips, and it was Patience herself, propped in a chair Hetty had insisted upon rather than let her stand, who asked him the single question the whole matter turned upon. "You copied this roll in your own hand, Mr. Coyle, in November, though it is dated October. Who paid the 3 crowns entered against your name that same quarter, and did she pay you in coin, or only in the promise of more to follow once the marriage was undone?" He held out a moment longer than anyone expected, his ink-stained thumb working against his forefinger, and then the whole of it came out of him in a rush. The coin, the instruction. The fear of losing his place if he refused a woman who ran the house's accounts and could ruin a clerk with a stroke of the same pen she had asked him to falsify, and Rosalind Vane, hearing her own scheme laid bare in a frightened clerk stammering, did not weep and did not deny it, but sat very still with her hand risen, without her seeming to notice it had moved. To touch the bare place at her collar where a locket had once hung, years before, when she had been young enough still to believe her cousin might one day have looked at her the way he had never once looked at anyone, but the curate's daughter he had married for order, and kept, in the end, for love he had been too frightened to name. "I did it for Julian," she said at last, very quietly, into a room gone entirely silent to hear her. "I have spent my whole life keeping this house running for a man who never once needed me the way I needed him to, and I could not bear to watch him give away, to a stranger, everything I had kept safe for my own son with my own hands, unpaid, unthanked, for 20 years. I am not sorry for wanting it, I am only sorry I was caught." Gideon, who had said nothing through the whole of it, crossed the gallery at last and stood before her the way a man stands at a grave he did not expect to visit so soon. "You will go to the dower house at Ashendale," he said, with an allowance sufficient to want for nothing, "and Julian's schooling will be paid in full until he is a man grown able to make his own way, honestly, in whatever trade or profession he chooses. You will not be prosecuted. You will not be named publicly beyond what has already been said in this room today. I do this not for your sake, Rosalind, but because Julian is innocent of his mother's arithmetic, and because I find, having very nearly lost everything to one unforgiving man's idea of justice, that I have no wish to hand another child the same inheritance. Rosalind's composure broke, at last, not into anger, but into something far older and sadder, a single tear traced without drama down a face that had been immaculate for 20 years, and she rose and left the gallery with her gray silk rustling and her back very straight, and no one in that room, watching her go, found it in themselves to feel triumphant. It was only after the gallery had emptied, after Sir Josiah had torn the unsealed decree in two with his own hands and pronounced, with evident relief, that no divorce had ever in fact been lodged, and none now would be, that Gideon came to sit beside his wife's chair and found he did not know how to begin the apology 18 months of silence had made enormous. "I would rather be right and alone," he said, quoting, lo, the very words he had once flung at her in the dark of the estate office, than glad and fooled. "I told you that once, and I meant it as a shield, and I find I have spent a great deal of my life admiring my own shield and calling the admiration courage. And now I find I would rather be fooled 100 times over and glad in 99 of them than be right once more in the manner I was right this April, and alone in the manner I so nearly made myself." He took her hand, the one that had tapped its silent tallies against her thumb through every frightened night of the last 2 months, and held it still. "I do not ask you to forgive me because a clerk confessed, or because my cousin's arithmetic has been proven false. I would have you know that I had already begun, before Coyle ever opened his mouth, to doubt the ledger and trust the fire instead, and that whatever this room decided today, I had resolved, somewhere in the small hours, that I would rather spend the rest of my life wrong about a great many small things than right about the one thing that would have cost me you." "That," said Patience, "is the nearest thing to a declaration I have ever heard a duke attempt, and I find I have no wish to correct its arithmetic." "Then let me attempt the rest of it properly. I love you, Patience Vane, not for what the dispatch book proved, nor for what these 2 small strangers in your arms have made of us both, but for the woman who told my cousin that dignity was not for sale. And I would have chosen you regardless of what that gallery decided today, though I thank every merciful power in heaven that it decided rightly. There was no grand wedding to mark what followed, only a quiet blessing said over the 2 of them and their sleeping children by the parish's new curate on a bright morning in May, with Hetty calm, weeping without shame into a handkerchief she had brought for the purpose in declaring, between sobs, that she had delivered a great many happy endings in her time, but never one she'd had quite so large a hand in proving. Sir Josiah saw to it, before the summer was out, that the £11 4 shillings once owed by a poor curate to a miller and an apothecary were quietly discharged from the ducal purse, and that a modest stone was raised over Reverend Ray's grave, bearing his name and his years, and a line his daughter chose herself, that here lay a man who taught his child that a column of figures, honestly kept, will outlast every lie told against it. Mr. Coyle was dismissed from his post, but not from the county's mercy. Gideon found him honest work at a neighboring estate on the single condition that he never again touch a ledger he had not been asked to keep, and he kept that condition and his nerve for the rest of his working life. Cecily Thorne, chastened and rather less cool than before, became in time an unlikely friend to the Duchess whose marriage she had once been so ready to doubt, and was married the following spring to a quiet, kind widower 2 counties distant, who had never once heard the old rumor, and never would. Rosalind Vane lived out her years at Ashendale in a comfort she had not, strictly, earned and did not, in the end, entirely waste. And Julian grew to manhood believing his mother guilty of nothing worse than loving too fiercely and too late, which was, as near as anyone could determine, very close to the truth. The thrush in the Physic Garden went on singing past dusk for a summer or two more, out of habit, Hetty said, long after it had anything left in that house to complain of. A year almost to the day after a duke had signed away his own children in a corridor smelling of beeswax and blood, Patience stood in that same corridor near dusk with a child on each hip, watching her husband come up the stair 2 at a time, the way he had not done since he was a boy, his coat still damp from the garden, his face lit with the particular foolish joy of a man who has just watched his son take 4 steps unaided across a nursery floor and is bursting to say so before anyone else can. He did not carry, this time, any paper at all. He carried instead a small, unremarkable letter he had written that morning and meant to give her before supper, and when Hetty, passing with an armful of linen, asked him lightly whether he had signed anything interesting today, he laughed outright, the whole easy laugh she had once tracked like a rare bird's first song and now heard nearly every day, and said that the only thing he intended to sign for the rest of his life was his own name beneath hers, over and over, on every ordinary paper an ordinary happy house required, and that he had found. At last, numbers do not lie, and neither, in the end, did he. If this story warmed you the way a fire warms a room that has stood cold too long, then come sit a while longer by this one before you go. There is always a chair kept, and the kettle is always near enough the boil. Tell me, if you would, which line stayed with you longest, the midwife's question at the door, or the answer it took a whole year to earn. Stay close to the hearth if you'd like more of these told slow and true. There is always room for one more by the fire, and the door is never latched against a friend. Sleep well tonight, and be a little braver than pride would have you be the next time someone you love needs you to trust the fire over the ledger.